Hello and welcome back to CFI Helper. If you've watched my previous video on the standard circuit, you should now understand how a basic circuit is flown. You're going to encounter many different airports during the time building portion of your training. So today we're going to be talking about how circuits differ depending on the type of airport you are flying into. The circuit pattern stays the same. What changes is who you talk to and who's managing traffic. Quick note, my format is a little different this time. Usually I write things out during my videos, but to make it more worth your time today, I have a lot of the text already written out. I'll highlight some of the important stuff that I'm talking about, but we'll cover everything, so don't worry. Let's start with MF airports, mandatory frequency. They're considered uncontrolled airports, but with a bit more structure. At an MF airport, this is one of the biggest differences, traffic is usually coordinated by FSS, a flight service station. So there may be someone watching traffic remotely, or CARS, a community aerodrome radio station, and there may be someone actually at the airport. These airports usually have pretty high traffic. There may also be an instrument approach at the airport, and an MF can be designated at an airport that's controlled during other times of the day, but when the tower isn't in operation, it turns into an MF. It's really important to remember that when we're talking to FSS, that's really crooked, sorry. FSS is not ATC, okay? They don't give clearances, but they do give instructions and traffic advisories to help keep things organized. You're required to make radio calls on the MF, so you need radio equipment, and you're expected to follow instructions given, unless doing so would be unsafe. As well, aircraft without radio equipment, also known as Nordo aircraft, are not permitted unless they've given FSS or CARS prior notice of their intentions, okay? So you will be informed of this in a traffic advisory. There are some specific numbers depending on when that aircraft is going to be there and when you're going to be flying into the airport. But just know you'll be warned about the aircraft at the MF airport. When entering an MF, you need to remember to make your call at least 5 minutes out. So that's going to be your initial call. You can indicate your position, altitude, and arrival intentions. So how are you planning to join the circuit? Are you planning to do a full stop? Are you planning to do a touch and go? That sort of thing. Some MFs have an AWOS for you to listen to. It's similar to an ATIS, the ATIS giving you weather, runway, and NOTAM information, but the AWOS is less descriptive. It doesn't give as many details. Make sure you listen to this if it's available before you make your initial call. Let's quickly go over 2 MF airports here. Okay, so we have Muskoka, and I'm in the comms section of the CFS here. So you can see that it says MF, and if we keep going to the right, it says Timmins Radio 1223. So why does it say Timmins if we are going to the Muskoka airport? Well, Muskoka has an MF linked to Timmins Radio. The people aren't actually at Muskoka. They are at Timmins, and there's nobody physically watching you when you're at Muskoka, okay? So they're not there to visibly see what's going on. So in order to call Timmins Radio at Muskoka, you can just say Timmins Radio, and when you're giving your position, you'll most likely mention that you're, for example, 8 miles southeast of Muskoka. Or if it makes you more comfortable, you can say Timmins Radio at Muskoka. Okay, and then we would make this call on 1223. We can see our dimensions here. It's 5 nautical miles, 3,900 ASL, and like I wrote previously in the notes, which we'll go back to, MF is usually 5 nautical mile radius and 3,000 feet above aerodrome elevation. So the 3,900 ASL is including elevation at Muskoka. And then we can see here that Muskoka has an AWOS. So we would need to make sure we listen on this frequency for the AWOS before we make our initial call to Timmins Radio. Now, Kingston is another example here. Kingston has an ATIS though, so this one is a more in-depth description of weather, runway, NOTAMs. And we need to make sure we listen to this frequency beforehand. Kingston also has an MF, but Kingston's MF is only in operation during these hours, okay? So that's a little bit different from Muskoka. Timmins is an MF from 11:15 Zulu until 0400 Zulu, and you would call them on 1225. Now, Kingston here, it only says radio. It doesn't have another word in front. We're going to use the name of the airport that we're going to when we're making the call, and we would say Kingston Radio, okay? And then you can see here that Kingston turns into an ATF outside of those hours. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. But then here we would just refer to traffic. We would be saying Kingston traffic, not Kingston radio. And something I forgot to mention, but that I think is super important, is, for example, for Muskoka, what if you call Timmins radio and you get no response? Maybe there's nobody working, and you're now changing your call into a broadcast call. So in this case, we could say Muskoka traffic instead of Timmins radio at Muskoka, because now we're just talking to the other aircraft at the Muskoka airport. Now, let's talk really quickly about joining the circuit at an MF. When joining the circuit, you're typically going to join at circuit altitude. There are many ways to join the circuit at an MF, so let's go over the different options. You can do number 1, which is upwind. From upwind, you'll join the mid-left downwind, for example. You could join straight in on downwind. You could join 45 degrees on downwind. You could do straight in on base or straight in on final, okay? So those are the 5 ways that you could join the circuit at an MF. However, FSS may actually instruct you on how to join the circuit if it's relatively busy. As you fly the circuit, you'll make standard calls like joining downwind, when on downwind, final, and when clear of the runway after landing. And you'll be listening closely to both FSS and the other aircraft. When taking off and departing the circuit, climb runway heading until clear of the circuit, so past circuit altitude, before turning. And remember that turns back or towards the airport shouldn't be done until you're at least 500 feet above circuit altitude. Also, if you're just starting your flight, you'll need to ensure you've stated your takeoff intentions on the ground before entering onto the runway, as well as remember to make a call when you're rolling and airborne. A key thing to remember here for the MF is you're still responsible for separation, but there's someone helping manage the overall flow of traffic. Okay, let's move on to the ATF airport, the aerodrome traffic frequency, which is the most basic form of an uncontrolled aerodrome. At an ATF, there is no specialist and no controller. You're talking only to other pilots. All radio calls are position reports and intentions. You're announcing what you're doing, not asking for permission. Okay, so ATFs are still relatively active airports, just maybe not as high traffic as an MF. At this airport, though, Nordo aircraft can actually operate without restrictions at these airports. They no longer need to give prior notice to FSS or CARS, so it's really important to keep an eye out for these aircraft. Where there's a Unicom, you'll use the published frequency, a common frequency being 122.8, and you might get asked this on your CPL written. Same with if there's no Unicom, you'll be using 123.2. Let's go over 2 quick examples of ATF airports. Okay, so we have Stratford here. Once again, these are pulled out from the CFS, and we can see that it says ATF here. This says Unicom limited hours. Okay, so you would make similar calls as you would at an MF airport. However, here you can call Unicom for an airport advisory. So for example, we could say Stratford Unicom, Cessna 172, Golf Golf Charlie November, requesting airport advisory. Once you've finished receiving the airport advisory, you can now start referring your calls to traffic and giving them your 5 minutes out call, so position, altitude, arrival intentions, etc. Okay, because now you're broadcasting your call to other aircraft. You're not specifically talking to the Unicom ground station anymore. Here, the Unicom is only working during certain hours. You can find more information about this on the CFS. Over here, we see our frequency is 1228. Once again, our dimensions are here. And then we have Reeds Field as an example, also an ATF. This one doesn't have a Unicom, so we're going to say Reeds Field traffic, and then we have 123.2 as our frequency. Once again, dimensions are over here. Okay, so when joining the circuit, you'll once again typically join at circuit altitude. There are less ways to join the circuit at an ATF, and I believe this is because you no longer have that added layer of safety for mandatory calls. So let me show you really quickly what these are. You can come upwind, or you can come straight on downwind. And that's it. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is, what if your airplane was coming from over here, and you wanted to join upwind, for example? You can do something called a teardrop maneuver. So you're flying over here, but it's really important to remember that when you're doing this and you're flying in this direction, you should be at least 500 feet above circuit altitude, okay? Now, why? Because if you were flying this direction at circuit altitude, you could very easily collide with another plane flying on downwind. So make sure that if you are deciding to do the teardrop maneuver, you're flying at least 500 feet above circuit altitude, and then you'll also mention that you're going to be doing a teardrop maneuver, okay? Just so that whoever is flying knows that. So because no one is actively managing traffic for you at an ATF airport, situational awareness is very important. especially because of those Nordo aircraft, okay? Who knows what those Nordo aircraft are doing? Make sure you're actively listening, looking out for traffic, and building a mental picture of where everyone is and adjusting as needed. Okay, so your entering calls to the MF are going to be basically the same. You'll still make your initial call 5 minutes out. You'll call when you're joining. You'll make the same circuit calls. I even like to add a little bit extra into my circuit calls. I'll add when I'm turning base. And taking off and departing is the same as the MF, okay? So you'd climb runway heading, clear of the circuit before turning. And again, if you were just starting your flight, you would report the same as you would at an MF. So at ATF airports, the big focus is look, listen, and fit in safely. One thing I didn't mention is this asterisk here is just saying that the MF and the ATF have similar dimensions, so ATF will also usually be a 5 nautical mile radius to 3,000 feet above aerodrome elevation. Finally, let's compare those to a controlled airport. At a controlled airport, your dimensions are going to be specified on the CFS, so you can find those there. But the biggest difference here is that traffic is managed by air traffic control, also known as ATC. Here, you must communicate with tower, and you need to receive a clearance to enter the airspace, circuit, taxi, takeoff, land, or cross a runway. You name it, you need clearance. Unlike MF and ATF airports, you don't decide how to join the circuit. ATC will tell you. They may clear you straight in, they might sequence you behind other traffic, or change your circuit entirely. I've been asked to change circuits for a different runway mid-air. Your job as the pilot here is to comply with the instructions, maintain your situational awareness, and feel free to speak up if something is unsafe or unclear. I really want to stress that you require clearance to land, okay? Doesn't matter if you are 200 feet above the runway and you are close, short, final. If you don't have that clearance, you pull up, you go around, and you mention that you're going around to ATC. Entering calls are going to be basically the same, okay? So we make sure we listen to ATIS, and we're going to call 5 minutes out. Sometimes at this airport, they will just tell you to ident, so you would press ident on your transponder and you'll show up on their radar, and that saves you from having to give them a lot of information about your specific location, okay? But you'll still have to mention your altitude and what you're intending to do on arrival, okay? Are you planning to do a full stop? Are you planning to do a touch and go? If you are calling a controlled airport and they don't ask you to squawk ident, you may have to give them more specific information about your location. Finally, I think the main calls I want to mention here for you about the circuit are your mid-downwind call. Okay, so if you were on downwind over here, you would call tower and just let them know you are mid-left downwind runway 23, for example, if you're doing left-hand circuits. And these are super important. When they call telling you you are clear to take off, you make sure you read that back, okay? Same with coming into land. If they clear you to land, you make sure that you are calling them back and letting them know that you've been cleared to land. It's just maintain that communication between you and tower. Now, really quickly here, this is Waterloo for our example here. Okay, so we see that tower is going to be on the frequency 126, and we have our hours here. So it seems that tower is only in operation from 12 until 4 Zulu. Here, it shows that it turns into an MF on the same frequency from the hours when it is not being controlled. Okay, so this is one of those examples where it's a controlled airport during these hours, and then when the tower isn't in operation, it turns into an MF. And when you are making your first call here, you would make your first call to Waterloo Tower. But when it turns into an MF, you're now saying Waterloo Traffic. And then once again, this is just our ATIS here, 1251, and once again, we have our dimensions here. I hope that was helpful. I tried to fit the most I could onto one page here so you can see everything neatly. If there's anything I missed that you'd like me to go over, anything you want me to further explain, please let me know and I'd be happy to help. But otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.